We are in the book of Genesis this morning. We're going to study Sarah on this Mother's Day. And we'll be in Genesis chapter 17. We're going to look at chapter 18. We're going to reference chapter 21. We're going to reference chapter 12. But if you just kind of want to park somewhere, it would be Genesis chapter 17 and 18. I believe that Sarah is a living object lesson for moms and for all of us. Mother or not, married or not, single or not, female, male, whatever. I believe that each of us can learn some important lessons from the life of Sarah, who God said you will call the mother of many nations. And the first thing that sticks out about Sarah is that she was a woman of faith. Most human beings, maybe all human beings, I don't know, but most human beings have some need for a sense of security in their lives. You know, the times that I find myself getting the most tense are the times when I feel like things are the most out of control. And we feel the need for some sense of security, for some sense of control in our lives. Imagine being married to Abraham. Now, we talk a lot about Abraham, you know, the great man of faith, Abraham. But we need to think about Mrs. Abraham, you know, and what it was for her to be married to Abraham. He comes home one day and he says, "We're moving." And she says, "Where are we going?" And he said, "I'm really not sure. Someplace called Canaan, but God said we're supposed to go. There's an area called Haran. We're supposed to go there." She packs up, leaves her family, leaves her friends, leaves the security of everything she knew, and followed Abraham. An amazing lady. And I was thinking about this. I wondered if maybe that's where Ruth got her insight. You remember Ruth is famous for saying to her mother-in-law, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." And you have to know that in the Jewish tradition, their oral traditions, the story of Abraham and Sarah was repeated from generation to generation. And it may well have been that the example of Sarah following Abraham to a place where they didn't know for sure where they were going gave Ruth the confidence to be able to say that same thing to her mother-in-law. "I'm going to go where you go. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people." So Abraham and Sarah stop off at Haran for 25 years. And then in chapter 12, God calls Abraham again. And again, he comes home. "Okay, honey, we've been here 25 years. Guess what? Time to move again." "Where are we going this time?" "Actually, I don't know. God said just go, and I'll tell you when you get there." And she goes. Incredible lady of faith. Because I can't prove this to you biblically, but it seems like there are times, you know, when God calls a husband to do something, that the wife has to kind of go along without that calling. When we started the church, Donna said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I don't have that word. Do you have that word?" You know, and so it took her faith that I knew, you know, what God had said to me, and that's harder. You know, if you've got a word from the Lord, that's one thing. But if you're following somebody's word from the Lord, that takes an additional layer of faith. And Sarah is this lady of faith. She gets a lot of blame for bringing Hagar into the picture, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But let's first acknowledge that she was a woman of great faith. In fact, she's one of only two women mentioned by name in Hebrews 11, the great faith chapter. Verse 11 says, "Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Great woman of faith. And she had faith that God would keep his promise. Having an heir in Abraham's day was incredibly important. He and Sarah had no children. In Genesis chapter 15, Abraham says to God, maybe my servant is going to be the one to carry on my lineage. And God says to him, no, chapter 15, verse 4, your flesh and blood will be your heir. And then in Genesis chapter 17, God visits Abraham. Verse 15. God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. And I never caught verse 17. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Now, in chapter 18, God comes back and visits Abraham, and he says, about this time next year, Sarah will bear a son. And it says Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbirth. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, am I worn out and my Lord is old and now I'll have this pleasure? Sarah laughed. In fact, I preached a sermon one time called Why Did Sarah Laugh? But I never realized that a chapter earlier, Abraham laughed. And not only did he laugh, Sarah laughed to herself. Abraham fell face down and laughed. Now, he's 99 when this conversation happens. Sarah is 89. And so God comes and tells this 99-year-old man, in about a year, you're going to have a kid. And Abraham falls face down and laughs. Now, I don't know what that picture is to you, but in my mind, that picture of him is just like he had the giggles. You know, he's face down on the ground. He's pounding the ground and kicking his legs. Saying, yeah, right. I'm going to be a daddy when I'm 100. He laughed. Sarah, when she hears the angels say to her husband, about this time next year, Sarah's going to give birth, she laughs. Because, see, the message that they were getting was way out of line with what their expectations were and what their assumptions were. Their assumption was, we're too old to have children. God said, I'm going to work a miracle. Have you ever gotten a promise from God and kind of laughed? Either laughed because it seemed rather absurd, or laughed because it seemed so improbable, or laughed because it was a nervous laughter and you weren't quite sure what was going on and how it was going to work out? God loves to put our assumptions to the test. God loves to show us that what is impossible with man is possible with God. And when you hear yourself say, God, you got to be kidding me, just remember Isaac, born when Sarah's 90 and Abraham's 100. God has ways of doing things we can't handle. And a word to moms and a word to all of us, God may have given you a promise and you've not seen the fulfillment of that yet. Learn from Sarah. And I want to give you this timeline, because God does not work within our time frame. That's one of the hardest things for us to learn about God. He doesn't work within our time frame. We work in minutes and seconds and hours. God works in generations. God is a farmer. He sows and he takes care of the ground and he takes care of the soil, and then the harvest comes. We want something overnight. God takes the long view. The original promise that came to Abraham in Genesis 12, Abraham is 75 years old when God says, I'm going to give you an heir. That's 24 years before chapter 18. I don't know how long you've been waiting on the fulfillment of a promise. It may well be that there are people watching or people in this room, you've been praying the same prayer for 24 years, waiting on an answer, waiting on God to come through. I want to encourage you from the example of Sarah, keep on trusting and keep on praying and don't give up, because God does not work within our time frame. You know, if God said to me, you're going to have a kid, I'd figure about 9 months we're going to have a kid. 25 years from promise to fulfillment. Because God's work is not tied to our abilities. That was Sarah's problem. That was Abraham's problem. In chapter 18, verse 12, Sarah says, I'm worn out, and Abraham's old. See, we get in trouble when we limit God to our limitations. But we tend to do that, don't we? We get a promise from God. We feel like God has given us a word about something. And then we try to figure out how we can bring it about. Now, maybe I shouldn't confess for you. I'll confess for me. If I feel like I've got a word from the Lord, I try to figure out how I can bring it to pass. No. If it's a word from the Lord, it's His responsibility to bring it to pass. And it's so important for us to learn that God's promise, God's plan, God's work is not tied to our own abilities. And I want to really emphasize that to those of you who are moms, however you're a mom. Because so many moms I know feel like it's their responsibility to make things happen. And sometimes you just can't make them happen. You've got to wait for God to make it happen. His work is not tied to our own abilities. And another good word from Sarah, God can work through people who fail. Aren't you glad for that? God can work through people who fail. Now, the devil will tell you that the reason you haven't received the promise yet is because you've not prayed enough, or you've not prayed hard enough, or you've not fasted long enough, or you've not given enough, or you've not worked hard enough, or you're not holy enough, and somehow it's your fault. Most moms I know think everything that's wrong with their kids is their fault. Hey, my mom was great about that. Where have I failed? It's my fault. And I don't know if that's something that happens, when you become a mom, you get that thing in your system. Dads just say, oh, they're just idiots. Moms say, oh, we did something wrong. We should have done better. Well, I just want you to know that God works through imperfect people. God can work through people who fail. Abraham was not perfect. Sarah was not perfect. Remember, they brought Hagar into the picture in Genesis chapter 16, 10 years after the original promise. And out of the union of Hagar and Abraham is born Ishmael. Now, there's a whole sermon there, because Ishmael is the father of the Arab nations. Isaac is the father of the Jewish nation. And from the time Isaac was born, Ishmael was probably about 14 at the time. As soon as Isaac was old enough to get up and toddle around, there was conflict between Ishmael and Isaac. There continues to be conflict between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac. And every time you read about a problem in the Middle East, remember that ultimately it stems back to the fact that they brought Hagar into the picture, and that was not God's plan. And politicians think they can fix it. No, it's not going to be fixed till Jesus comes back and enforces peace with the rod of iron. But in Genesis chapter 21, after Hagar, after that mistake, the Bible says God was gracious to Sarah. And they named their son Isaac. You know what Isaac means? Laughter. I love that. It's like when God told Abraham, you're going to have a son, Abraham breaks out in a fit of the giggles and falls face down on the ground and laughs. When Sarah hears about this time next year she's going to have a son, she laughs to herself. But God is gracious to those who have trouble believing. And she names the son Isaac. Laughter. As I was looking over these notes last night, it hit me that probably every time she looked at Isaac, she remembered that laughter. And she remembered the promise of God. Which leads me to ask you this. Are there some Isaacs in your life? Are there some things in your life that if you think about it, are living testimonies to the faithfulness of God? Maybe it's a child of promise. Maybe it's a child that, is surviving that they didn't think would. Maybe it's a job that you never dreamed you could get. Maybe it's a marriage you never dreamed you could get. The things in your life that are miracles of God, that the only reason they are in your life is because of the graciousness of God. Pay attention to the Isaacs in your life. Pay attention to the gifts of God that are just absolutely supernatural in your life. So Sarah is a great lady of faith. The second thing about Sarah is she teaches us about waiting. Again, here's the timeline. When God calls them from Ur to go to Canaan, Abraham is 50. Sarah is 40. When God calls them from Haran and gives them the promise of Genesis 12, I will make you the father of many nations and your descendants will be like the stars in the sky, Abraham is 75. Sarah is 65. Genesis 16 says it was 10 years later that Sarah brought Hagar into the picture. And by the way, that was fairly common in those days, that if a wife was unable to conceive, she would give her husband the servant. And if there was a child born from that union, that child would be the legal heir. That wasn't God's plan. I mean, she waited 10 years. I guess you got to give her some credit for that. But that wasn't God's plan. And 14 years after Hagar is Genesis 17 and 18. And Abraham's now 99. Sarah's 89. And God says, here's your promise, Abraham. And he gets very specific. Chapter 17, verse 16. Chapter 18, verse 10. You and Sarah, you and your wife will have a son. It was 25 years from the promise to the birth of Isaac. That's a long time to wait. Sometimes 25 seconds is a long time to wait, isn't it? But 25 years is a long time to wait. Little 4-year-old boy was traveling with his mom. They were going somewhere on a trip, and he was constantly asking that same question. When are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? You know, I'm not 4, but I still have that question in my mind anytime I'm in the car longer than about 2 hours. You know, when are we going to get there? When are we going to get there? And finally, she had had enough. And she said, we've still got 90 more miles to go. Don't ask me again when we're going to get there. And the little boy's real quiet. And after a few minutes, in a quiet voice, he says, Mom, will I still be 4 when we get there? Sometimes we wonder, Lord, when am I going to get this answer? When is it going to come through? Waiting's difficult. I don't need to tell you that. You know that. Waiting is tough. There's something about the human psyche that we don't like to wait. And one of the hardest lessons in the life of faith is learning to wait on God, because waiting requires patience with God. It's one thing to have to be patient waiting on somebody. Donna's having to do a lot of waiting for me. She gets to the car before I do now. She's able to move quicker than I am right now. And it's hard to wait. But when you're waiting on God, and He's not telling you why you have to wait, it's tough. And so many times we find ourselves giving our problems to God, and then we take them back because we don't like the fact that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. We want it now. And we have to learn patience with God, because we not only have to trust His plan, we have to trust His timing. Don't get ahead of God. Be patient with God. Be patient with His timing, because waiting requires trusting God when we don't understand. If you know you're waiting on something and you know what you're waiting for and it's guaranteed that it's coming, you can wait. But when you don't understand, that's when it's hard. Because God did not tell Abraham and Sarah, by the way, it's going to be 25 years before you have this child. He just said you're going to have a child. And your descendants are going to be like the sands on the seashore and the stars in the sky. But He didn't give them the time frame. And so many times when we wait on the promise of God, He doesn't give us the time frame. And in Genesis 16, when Sarah, after 10 years, decides to bring Hagar into the picture, she prefaces that decision by saying, the Lord has kept me from having children. So, I don't understand what's going on. I had this promise. I don't understand what's going on. I struggle with not being able to understand things. I want to be able to understand. What is God doing and why? What is He not doing it and why? What lesson am I learning, or what lesson am I supposed to be learning? And I don't like not being able to understand. It's one of the real challenges that I have in the life of following Christ, is trusting Him when I don't understand. It's getting easier, but it's still not easy. And it goes back to Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, where God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. I know those verses. I preach on those verses. But I still try to figure it out. God, I know your ways are not my ways. They're higher than mine. But would you please tell me what's going on? I want to understand. I think part of that is the way I'm wired up. I like to know where the pieces of the puzzle fit. On my job, I like to know how what I'm doing impacts and interacts with the other people on the team, and how what I'm doing is important to them, and how what they do is important to me. I like to know how it all fits together. And of course, in my work, I have a lot of people ask a lot of questions that begin with why, and they think the pastor or the chaplain should have the answer, and I don't. And so I say, God, why? And he doesn't answer. And I've got to learn, and I'm trying to learn, that God's ways are different than mine. And there are going to be a lot of times that I don't understand why things are happening or not happening the way they are or are not happening. What I have to decide is, do I trust God enough to trust him that he knows what he's doing? I finally am getting to the point where I can say, I don't know why, but I trust God, and he knows why. And that's enough. Now, I'm okay until it gets to the that's enough part, because I still want to be able to understand it. Sarah wanted to be able to understand it. Why did this promise not come? It's been 10 years. Why hasn't the promise been fulfilled? It's been 20 years. Why hasn't the promise been fulfilled? But finally, 25 years later, Abraham and Sarah bring forth Isaac. And I want to say to you, moms and dads and all of us, you're not always going to be able to understand why things are going the way they are. You won't always be able to understand how God is working. You won't always be able to understand why the things that are going on in your kids' lives are going on. You know, when you become a parent, all of a sudden it's what's harder on you is what's going on in your children's lives than what's going on in your own life. And you want to see them make good decisions, and you want to see them live for the Lord. And sometimes reverses come, and you wonder why, and your heart aches and breaks for them. And we just have to say, God, your work is not tied to my abilities. Doesn't matter how good or how bad of a parent I was. You've got to do this, God. It's not up to me. It's up to you. Do you trust him? Are you able to trust God with your children? Are you able to trust God with your future and their future? Are you able to say, God, I give them to you? In our tradition, the tradition that Don and I grew up in, we had baby dedications. In some places they had baptism. We didn't use water, but it was an act of a parent-child dedication where we brought our children before the church and before God and committed as parents that we would do everything we could to train them up in the way that they should go. We were privileged that my dad was able to officiate at those with all three of our children. But as they get older, we need to keep doing that. Lord, they're yours. We give them to you. You work in their lives. You help them find you. You help them find their way. It's tough. But Sarah teaches us, keep your faith in God. You're trusting him, keep on trusting. It's been another year. The answer hasn't come yet. Keep on trusting. You're praying, keep on praying. God doesn't mind it if you say, well, Lord, here I am again, and it seems like this is the same prayer I've been praying for umpteen years. I don't know how many years umpteen is. It may be more than 25. But Lord, I've been praying this prayer a lot of times, and Lord, I'm going to keep on praying until the answer comes. Keep on praying. God is working more slowly than you wish he would. Keep on trusting. Keep on waiting. And one day, the answer will come according to his will. It's hard to wait. Keep trusting him. Keep your eyes on him. Moms, all of us, keep trusting him. Father, that's easy to say in church. Not quite as easy to live in our daily lives. That those times when we don't understand, but we need to keep trusting you. So, Lord, I pray for moms, dads, and each of us in this room, that we would have the grace to trust you more, that we would know that sometimes we have to wait, and sometimes we don't understand why. But on the other side of it is the answer. So help us, Lord, to trust you. You have proven through our lives that you are worthy of our trust. If the only thing you ever did for us was to die on the cross and be raised from the dead, that's enough. But Lord, daily you show us that you are worthy of our trust. Daily you answer prayers. Daily you load us with blessings and benefits. So help us, Father, to trust you more. And Lord, for those parents who are desperately praying about a situation in the lives of their children, I pray your assurance that you are hearing and you are answering. Give us the patience to trust not only your plan and your process, but your timing. We are your people. We trust you. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Happy Mother's Day. Thanks for coming. Thanks for tuning in. You're dismissed.